Color toning is the most powerful way of creating emotion in an image. It's basically allowing you to handcraft specific colors in your shadows, highlights, and midtones. I want to show you a process that allows you to take control of each of those segments in Photoshop without spending a ton of time. Color toning an image is something that I feel everyone should know how to do at least a little bit. And I say a little bit because there's a few tools in Photoshop that can easily give you creativity in bringing through a lot of colors in your image. Now, this is not the end-all be-all of color toning tutorials, but it's a good start in understanding how a few color toning tools work in Photoshop, how to combine that together, and a little bit of theory to go behind it. We have this image also shot by Sue that I think is a really good example because it combines a nice base color palette that can be built upon, but it doesn't mean that you only have to work on studio images for this example. It works on anything. It works on outdoor images, indoor images, and the whole 9 yards. So, first thing I find is that with color, it seems to work better when we start desaturating the image just a little bit as a base. This is not a rule, this is more of a suggestion. So let's say that we go in here and we go into, say, the black and white filter, and maybe we increase or decrease some of these a little bit for some effect. But more importantly, we're just gonna drop the opacity down to about 20%, because we're not trying to desaturate the image, but we're trying to bring the saturation down a little bit in order for the colors that we build on top to play and have some more room, if that makes sense. And I'm going to illustrate that later on by turning off the black and white layer so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Let's say we want to, in theory purposes, enhance some of the cool metallic colors that are coming through. Maybe we want to add more blues and cool down the shadows. And a typical example would be the opposite for the highlights. We want to increase the warmth in the highlights. A very cinematic look done in a few moments. So first step is understanding a couple of tools. One is going to be selective color. And I think that's going to be the easiest to explain. Because selective color has a few key options that it gives us. And I think it's the easiest one just because it's almost self-explanatory in that over here we have these different channels spanning from red all the way to magenta. And what they mean is that if I click on my red channel, it tells me that anything that I start modifying is going to modify the reds in the image. So if I increase this left and right, you notice that it just modifies her skin tone. And that's pretty cool because it almost makes a selection of just her skin tone. So instead of adding cyan, maybe I can add magentas, yellows, and so forth. To reset these sliders, just double click on the name itself, or nope, you have to double click on the name. So instead of shifting these tones around, we can increase obviously the luminosity as well using the black slider below, which is almost like density. You can increase and decrease how bright and luminous that color is. Instead of modifying the skin tone, what we're going to do is come down here to our whites, neutrals, and blacks. And here, this is representative of our highlights, midtones, and our shadows. The highlights themselves are more indicative for areas that are really bright. In this image, we don't really have any highlights because it's a dark image. And instead, what we'll do is we'll come down to our neutrals, and then we can add some warmth over here. So we might add a little bit of yellow. We might add a little bit of magenta and see how that looks. And I don't think that's looking pretty good. I'm going to bring that back over here. Anything that goes on the opposite of the spectrum goes to the opposite color. So this one goes to a red, the magentas themselves go to green if we take it away, and the yellows themselves go to more of a blue look. Another area that we can play with is our shadows. And the shadows, we can increase the cool tones in the shadows. I think that looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit of magenta added in the mix, like 1%. And the cyans themselves, I think, look really good if we add a little bit of cyan there. And maybe we'll drop the yellow back. Let's see, we'll go -1 for our yellow, +1 for our magenta, and +2 for our cyan. So we've utilized the selective color to add quite a cool tint into the shadows. So let's use selective color for our shadows. So we'll use one adjustment layer for each to give you an idea of what's happening. Next, we'll go into our color balance, if I can find it, which is right there. And the color balance is even more user-friendly in that it has a description of shadows, highlights, and midtones. And for our midtones, we can independently decide what color we want again, and it labels them. So we have red, cyans, greens, magentas, blues, and yellows. Unlike selective color, where it only labels the cyan, and if you go right, it adds more cyan. In the color balance feature, if we go left, it adds more cyan. Why it's like that, honestly, I don't know, but it gives you a visual indication and makes things a little bit more clear for you. If you're beginning to start color toning, I think that the color balance may be a better way to go, just because it indicates what's happening, and there's no surprises. So you can go back into our shadows and modify things that way in case we want to add it further as a building process, and if not, then it's no big deal as well. The most interesting thing is if we add yellows into the shadow, it almost warms up the shadow just a little bit, so it's not totally cool. It's adding that warmth, and it's also starting to impact the skin because the skin's in the midtones as well. I kind of like that look, so I'm going to keep the color balance for the midtones. Obviously, you could do the entire color grading process just by one adjustment layer, but this is a great example of how to use all of them in order to get that final look. Finally, let me talk about curves, because curves are probably the most powerful way of color grading, but it's also something that takes a little bit of getting used to. But curves are great because so far we've only used curves for dodge and burn and darkening lightning. But when you check out how we use it in retouching, we use it for luminosity for the most part. So instead of using it for luminosity, we're going to use it for color grading, or color toning, as some would say. Over here in the RGB, we have red, green, and blue again. So you notice a trend here in that all of these adjustment layers seem to have red, green, and blue as the fundamental breakdown of how they operate from the shadows, highlights, and midtones. Except this time, it doesn't allow you to select shadows, highlights, and midtones to begin with. It starts the opposite way. It says, which color spectrum do you want to modify? So for instance, if we go back to our color balance, we first select shadows, highlights, and midtones, and then we have RGB. So it works differently, okay? Curves work, again, by selecting the region. So let's say we think inversely. We want to add warm tones into our highlights. So the warm tones are going to be found in the blue, because the blue has blues and yellows, just like our color balance. It has blues and yellows. And the curve works the same way. If you go into our blue channel, and let's say we drag the curve down, it adds a lot of like blue and yellow and blue and green kind of look to the image. We can also hit delete and remove that point. And if we go to red, red happens when we pull it up. That cyan happens when we pull it down. Over here, the green, and then here we have magenta. So it's giving us the option to use curves for color grading, which is really interesting because it's like a little string that ties the shadows, highlights, and midtones together. Here's how this works. if we want to increase some warmth in our midtones and highlights, we'll drag the curve down. And this shows all the information in the image. So if we have a majority of the information located here, we want to start by focusing at the end of the spectrum. So adjusting this point over here adjusts most of the brightest parts of the image. We can also add some anchor tools. So if we add another dot here and bring it up using the arrow keys, it makes sure that no changes happen in any other parts of the image. So let me bring this further down here. So we have a gap. And just like that, when I turn this layer on and off, it adds some warmth into the highlight region. And so I'm going to come here and click on Curves, Highlights, and Midtones, Warmth. Another great thing about curves is that if you ever want to fade the image so that the brightness of the shadows and highlights are adjusted, curves can do that as well. If I click on the curves and add another one, and I want to increase some luminosity into the shadows, all I really need to do is hold down the dot at the end of my curve and bring it up. And what happens is it tends to fade some of those shadows. I'm going to use another pinpoint to pin down the curve here so it doesn't really change everything. I'm going to bring this up. So if I turn this on and off, you'll notice that it increases some of the luminosity of the image. Again, this is all artistic freedom, so there's no specific intention of me color grading for any reason other than a demonstration. But let's say that we group these layers together. And the way that I'll do this is I'm going to click on my top layer here and hold Shift and click on my black and white layer and then hit Command G. And what happens is that by default, it's going to manually clone the layers into a group. Now, just like that, I'm able to see exactly what I've done. I'm going to stack this layer here. If I turn these layers on and off, you'll notice that each of these layers change. So let's say, for instance, I go back and take a look at my first one. This black and white adjustment layer here, simply desaturate the image a little bit to add impact to our base. And then we built up here using some of these color adjustment layers. So the first part here at the bottom, if I keep all these color adjustment layers on and turn off the black and white layer, you'll find that it's actually quite important, because without this black and white layer on, the color grade competes with the original colors of the image. So there's not a lot of room for the colors to play. You know, the highlights being warm doesn't show off as much as if I desaturate the image just a little bit. So again, personal preference, but you can see the pros and cons of both sides. Now, let's turn these layers on and off again independently. If I click on selective color, you'll notice that it cools down the shadows, because what we did was we went into the shadows, or the, the black, and we adjusted it so we had more shadows, more magentas, and a little bit yellows. Then we went into color balance and tweaked the midtones just a little bit to add a little bit more warmth. So here we have the midtones. We dropped the cyans down. We increased and went to the yellow side to add a little bit more warmth. And then finally, we used the curve tool to color grade using the inverse method by going to the blue channel and then figuring out what we want to do. And since we're working on our highlights, we just brought the curve down a little bit on where the highlights are based on the histogram here. And then finally, we faded the image just a little bit to bring it all home. Hopefully this gives you an insight into how to color grade an image using a few of these adjustments, but keep in mind that you don't have to use all of them. I showed you 3 of them just so you can play with them, but ultimately they almost do the same thing.